The scalding coffee splashed across Emily Washington's uniform, soaking through the thin white fabric and searing the skin beneath. Her scream cut through the upscale restaurant like shattered glass, silencing the murmur of conversation and the delicate clink of crystal in an instant. She stumbled backward, hands instinctively reaching for her chest, where the liquid burned, tears already streaming down her face as angry red welts bloomed across her collarbone. And Don T. Campbell laughed. He actually laughed as he stood over her, still holding the empty cup like a trophy. His Ermenegildo Zegna suit probably cost more than Emily's annual tuition at community college. His Patek Philippe watch, more than 2 years of her mother's medical bills. And he was laughing, holding up his phone to capture her agony, his friends crowding around him to get the perfect angle for their Instagram stories. "That's what happens when you interrupt me during a business discussion, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as it carried throughout the now-silent restaurant. "Maybe next time you'll learn your place." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The other waitstaff froze in place, eyes downcast, knowing that intervention meant being blacklisted from every upscale establishment in the city. The wealthy patrons studied their wine lists and phone screens with sudden fascination, pretending they hadn't just witnessed assault in broad daylight. The restaurant manager, Marcus, stood near the kitchen entrance with his hands clasped, his face carefully neutral, already calculating how to protect the restaurant's reputation rather than his employee. In this glittering establishment in Manhattan's financial district, Don T. Campbell was untouchable royalty. The heir to Campbell Real Estate Holdings, a man whose family fortune had long ago placed him above such trivial concerns as law or basic human decency. His father had built an empire on displaced families and rezoning scandals. His son had inherited the empire, and none of the cunning required to maintain it, just the arrogance and the checkbook that made consequences disappear. But in the corner booth near the window, something shifted. A man in an impeccable charcoal suit carefully set down his espresso cup. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. His silver hair was swept back with meticulous precision, not a strand out of place. His cufflinks caught the afternoon light, understated platinum, no logos, no flash. Everything about him whispered rather than shouted. His face betrayed nothing as he observed the scene. His expression remained perfectly neutral, almost pleasant, but his eyes changed. Something ancient and dangerous flickered behind them, a cold calculation that spoke of violence witnessed and violence orchestrated, of empires built in shadows and enemies erased with surgical precision. Dominic Cross had seen enough. And Don T. Campbell had just made the worst mistake of his privileged life. If this story resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button now. Tell us in the comments what you think should happen to Campbell. Let's see how many of you believe in real consequences for the untouchable. Dominic Cross had not come to America to become what he now was. 30 years ago, he'd arrived with nothing but dock workers' hands and immigrant dreams of legitimate success. The American dream, they called it. Work hard, play by the rules, achieve prosperity. What a beautiful lie that had proven to be. He'd learned quickly that for immigrants like him, the rules were different. The system had sharp teeth for those without connections, without inherited wealth, without the right surname or zip code. The docks didn't care about his ethics. The landlords didn't care about his work ethic. The city didn't care about his dreams. So he'd adapted, survived, then thrived in the space between legitimate and criminal, where power actually lived. Now he controlled much of the East Coast's most sophisticated networks, not through brutality or territorial violence, but through information, leverage, and patience. The FBI had sanitized words for what he was: organized crime, racketeering, conspiracy. But Dominic preferred simpler terms. He was an arbitrator. Because when the system failed people, as it invariably did, Dominic Cross ensured balance was restored. His organization looked nothing like what most people imagined when they heard Mafia. No garish displays of wealth, no loud declarations of power, no bodies in rivers. Instead, there were political donations and nonprofit boards, strategic investments and corporate acquisitions. Judges who owed favors and prosecutors who suddenly found their evidence inadmissible. A network so sophisticated that most of his enemies never realized they were fighting him until their empires had already collapsed from within. His philosophy was simple. I don't break kneecaps, I break legacies. As Dominic stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a single practiced motion, his mind was already cataloging Don T. Campbell, Jr., second son of real estate magnate Donald Campbell, Sr., Harvard admission bought, not earned. Degree in business administration, barely. Now nominally vice president of acquisitions at Campbell Holdings, a position that meant attending fundraisers and terrorizing employees while actual executives did the work. 28 years old and had never faced consequences for anything in his life. Dominic's mental file on Campbell was extensive. He made it his business to know the city's power players and their weaknesses. The 3 sexual harassment settlements the family had buried. The DUI that disappeared after a donation to the police commissioner's re-election campaign. The fraud case that evaporated when the plaintiff suddenly accepted a 7-figure NDA. Even whispers of a tenant who'd fallen from a building after organizing a rent strike in a Campbell property, an incident that had been ruled accidental despite suspicious circumstances. Campbell was 28 years old and had never been told no in his life. Until now. Emily was still standing frozen near Campbell's table, coffee dripping from her uniform onto the polished hardwood floor. Another waitress, Maria, finally rushed over with a pitcher of ice water, her hands shaking as she tried to help. But Emily barely seemed to notice. She was staring at Campbell with an expression that Dominic recognized, the hollow-eyed look of someone whose last thread of hope had just snapped. Dominic knew Emily Washington, though she didn't know he knew her. He made it his business to know the people who worked in establishments he frequented. She'd been waitressing at Bellissimo for 4 months, always polite, efficient. She worked double shifts most weeks. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, the smile of someone who'd learned to make herself small, unthreatening, invisible. The smile of someone who couldn't afford to offend, because offending the wrong person meant losing the job that paid for her mother's chemotherapy treatments. Now she was standing in the wreckage of her livelihood, coffee-stained and humiliated, while the room full of witnesses pretended she didn't exist. The confrontation begins, measured approach. "Someone call an ambulance," Dominic said, his voice carrying across the restaurant despite its measured tone. Not a shout, not a demand. A simple statement of fact that somehow commanded more attention than Campbell's sneering performance. "She needs medical attention." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Don T. Campbell turned, irritation flashing across his handsome face at this interruption to his entertainment. His eyes swept over Dominic with the dismissive assessment of someone born to judge others by their usefulness to him. He saw an older man in an expensive but understated suit. No flashy jewelry, no recognizable designer labels, no one important. "Mind your own business, old man," Campbell snapped, his tone the same one he probably used on contractors and janitors. "She's fine. She's just being dramatic to shake me down for a bigger settlement. These people always are." Escalation, Dominic's controlled response. Dominic took 3 steps forward. His movement was unhurried, almost casual, but something in his bearing made Campbell's friends suddenly remember urgent phone calls they needed to take. They scattered from the table like roaches when lights turn on, leaving Campbell alone in his designer suit and inherited arrogance. "I said," Dominic repeated, now standing directly in Emily's line of sight, his voice softening slightly as he addressed her rather than Campbell. "Someone needs to call an ambulance. Miss Washington should not have to wait for medical care because of someone else's cruelty." The use of her name was deliberate. Emily's eyes widened slightly, surprised that this stranger knew who she was. In that moment, she stopped being invisible. Someone saw her. Someone acknowledged her as a person rather than furniture that served drinks. Campbell's face flushed with anger. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea who my father is?" Dominic finally turned his full attention to Campbell, and the younger man actually took a half step back. There was something in those calm gray eyes that didn't match the pleasant expression, something predatory and patient that had been assessing and judging and finding Campbell wanting. "Yes," Dominic said simply. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Campbell. The question is, do you know who I am?" The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees. Because in that moment, Don T. Campbell, Jr., realized that the restaurant had been silent not because they were too afraid of him to intervene. They were silent because they were too afraid of the man in the corner booth to breathe too loudly. And he had just made an enemy of Dominic Cross. Chapter 1: The Architect of Shadows. Dominic Cross had arrived in America 32 years ago with $47 in his pocket, a work visa sponsored by a shipping company, and the kind of naive optimism that only survives in people who haven't yet learned how the world actually works. He'd been 23 years old, fresh from military service in his home country, believing the mythology about meritocracy and hard work. His uncle had secured him the dock work in Brooklyn, backbreaking labor loading shipping containers, 12-hour shifts in weather that ranged from suffocating summer heat to bone-deep winter cold. The pay was barely enough for a shared room in a boarding house where 6 men rotated sleeping schedules because there were only 3 beds. But Dominic had been grateful, he'd been hopeful, he'd been stupid. The education had come quickly. The foreman who shorted paychecks, knowing immigrant workers wouldn't complain to authorities who might question their documentation. The landlord who raised rent arbitrarily, understanding his tenants had nowhere else to go. The union officials who took dues but provided no protection, pocketing the difference while workers got injured and discarded. The city itself, gleaming and merciless, that promised everything to those who worked hard but delivered only to those born into the right families. Dominic had watched men break themselves trying to play by rules that didn't actually exist. He'd attended the funeral of a coworker who died in an accident after threatening to report safety violations. An accident that happened the day before inspectors arrived. How convenient. He'd seen families evicted, while landlords collected insurance on condemned buildings that were renovated and sold for millions the following year. He'd witnessed justice fail so consistently, it became clear that failure was the design, not a flaw. The turning point had come during a dock strike. The workers had finally organized, demanding basic safety equipment and overtime pay. Dominic had been one of the organizers, translating demands into English, coordinating schedules. They'd been so certain that solidarity would prevail, that management would have to negotiate when the entire operation ground to a halt. Instead, management had simply waited. 3 weeks. 4. Men with families had broken first, crossing picket lines because their children needed to eat. Then management had brought in scabs and hired security, men with guns who weren't particularly concerned about labor law. The strike had collapsed. The organizers had been blacklisted, their names circulated to every shipping company, every warehouse, every dock operation along the eastern seaboard. Dominic Cross had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. Legitimate channels only work for people the system is designed to serve. So he'd stopped trying to work within systems. He'd started building his own. The first step had been information. While other desperate men looked for any work they could find, Dominic had started watching and listening. He'd noticed patterns, which inspectors accepted bribes, which union officials had gambling debts, which politicians made promises they never intended to keep, which business owners cheated their partners. He'd kept meticulous records in notebooks written in his native language, documenting everything he witnessed. Then he'd started trading information for favors. Small things at first, telling a restaurant owner about the health inspector who could be paid to overlook violations, warning a shop owner about the protection racket moving into the neighborhood, connecting people who needed things with people who provided things, taking a small percentage for the introduction. He'd been careful, strategic, patient. He'd understood what others didn't, that power wasn't about who could hit hardest but who knew the most. Violence was blunt and temporary. Information was precise and permanent. Within 5 years, he'd built a network. Within 10, he'd built an empire. He'd learned to speak without accent, to dress like the men who'd once denied him opportunities, to move through their world as if he belonged. He'd invested in legitimate businesses, restaurants, real estate, import-export companies that provided both income and perfect covers for money that needed cleaning. He'd cultivated relationships with politicians who needed campaign contributions and judges who needed help with inconvenient problems. He'd built a reputation not as a violent criminal, but as a sophisticated fixer who made problems disappear. The brilliance of Dominic's operation was its invisibility. There were no territories to defend, no product to move, no street-level violence that attracted federal attention. Instead, there was influence, leverage, strategic information deployed at precisely the right moment. A prosecutor building a case against one of Dominic's associates would suddenly find his key witness unavailable, the evidence mysteriously inadmissible. A business owner refusing to sell property Dominic wanted would discover health code violations, tax audits, and permit problems that made operations impossible. A politician who forgot whose money had funded their campaign would find their opponent suddenly well-financed and their personal indiscretions suddenly public. Dominic didn't break kneecaps. He broke careers, he broke reputations, he broke legacies. And he did it all while sitting in corner booths of upscale restaurants, dressed like a successful businessman, never raising his voice, never making threats that could be recorded or reported. Just quiet conversations where men left understanding exactly what would happen if they didn't cooperate, and how much worse their alternatives were. Now, 32 years after arriving with nothing, Dominic Cross controlled more of the eastern seaboard than most people realized. Mayors owed him favors. Judges ruled in his interests. CEOs accepted his investments. And the beautiful part was that most of them didn't even realize they were working for him until it was far too late to extract themselves. He'd become the very system that had once chewed him up and spit him out. The only difference was that his system had rules that actually mattered and consequences that actually happened. Even for billionaires' sons, who thought their money made them untouchable. Especially for them. Chapter 2. The Cathedral of Cowards. The restaurant had transformed into a tableau of cowardice, so perfectly choreographed it could have been rehearsed. At table 7, a hedge fund manager who'd loudly proclaimed his support for workers' rights at a charity gala, last month was suddenly fascinated by the Tuscan wine list. His wife, wearing a necklace worth more than Emily's car, studied her phone with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. They'd seen everything. The manager's wife had actually flinched when the coffee splashed. But now their faces were carefully blank, wiped clean of any evidence that they'd witnessed assault. Near the window, 2 tech executives who'd been mid-pitch about their startup's revolutionary approach to ethical business practices had gone completely silent. One of them had his hand halfway to his phone, probably to call for help, before his partner grabbed his wrist and shook his head. Not worth it. Campbell Money funded half the venture capital firms in the city. One phone call and their Series A funding would evaporate. The sommelier had disappeared entirely into the wine cellar. 2 waiters clustered near the kitchen entrance, whispering urgently, but making no move to help their colleague. Maria, the only one who'd brought ice water, was already being pulled back by another server who hissed something about not making it worse. This was how power really worked. Not through violence, though violence helped, but through the silent calculation that happened in dozens of minds simultaneously, each person weighing the cost of intervention against the cost of their mortgage, their children's tuition, their reputation in circles where reputation determined everything. Each person finding that the math didn't work out in favor of doing the right thing. Marcus, the restaurant manager, embodied this calculation perfectly. He approached Campbell's table with the posture of a man walking to his own execution, shoulders tight, face arranged in an expression of professional concern that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. He carried a fresh cup of coffee on a silver tray. "Mr. Campbell," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated to convey both deference and subtle disapproval, enough to claim later that he'd addressed the situation, not enough to actually offend. "Please allow me to offer you a fresh coffee. And of course there will be no charge for your meal today. I apologize for any," he paused, visibly searching for words that wouldn't assign blame. for any disturbance to your dining experience." Campbell took the coffee without looking at Marcus, as if accepting tribute from a subject. "About time. And you might want to train your staff better. That girl clearly doesn't understand how to behave around her betters." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, anger, perhaps, or shame. But it died as quickly as it appeared, smothered by pragmatism. The Campbell family had hosted private events at Bellissimo worth more than Marcus made in a year. Campbell SR sat on the board of the restaurant group that owned this location and 4 others. Marcus had a wife, 2 kids, and a mortgage in Westchester. "Of course, Mr. Campbell. Again, my sincerest apologies." Marcus turned without checking on Emily, without asking if she needed help, without even acknowledging that she'd been assaulted on his watch. He simply walked back toward the kitchen, each step a small betrayal that would probably keep him awake at night, but not enough to make him act differently. This was the cathedral of cowards, and they all worshipped at the altar of self-preservation. Emily had made it to the hallway leading to the bathrooms before she collapsed against the wall. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely grip the ice water Maria had thrust at her. The coffee had soaked through her uniform, the wet fabric clinging to burned skin that screamed with every movement. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing weight of humiliation, of helplessness, of knowing that everyone had watched and no one had helped. She could hear Campbell's laughter carrying from the dining room, hear him already telling the story to someone on his phone, spinning it into an anecdote about entitled service workers who needed to be put in their place. She could imagine it spreading through his social circle, through Instagram stories and group chats, transformed into entertainment, while she dealt with medical bills she couldn't afford and a job she'd almost certainly lost. Because that's what happened to people like her. The Campbells of the world got to assault people and face no consequences. The Emilys of the world got hurt and then got fired for causing a scene. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text from her mother. "How's your shift going, sweetie? Don't forget we have that appointment at the oncologist tomorrow at 10. Love you." Emily stared at the message, tears blurring the words. The appointment her mother couldn't afford to miss. The treatment they were already struggling to pay for. The insurance that barely covered anything and required Emily to work full-time to maintain. She couldn't lose this job. She couldn't afford to press charges or make a complaint or do anything that would mark her as trouble in an industry where managers traded blacklists like baseball cards. She'd have to go back out there, apologize to Marcus for causing a disruption, probably apologize to Campbell if asked, and hope that she'd still have a job at the end of her shift. That was the calculus of powerlessness. It didn't matter that she was right. It didn't matter that she'd been assaulted. It only mattered that she needed the money more than she needed justice. Emily tried to stand, winced at the pain, and pressed her forehead against the cool wall. She was alone in this hallway, alone in this situation, alone in a city where nobody helped people like her because helping cost too much. She didn't know that in the dining room, everything had just changed. She didn't know that the man in the charcoal suit was someone who understood powerlessness better than anyone in that restaurant. And she definitely didn't know that he'd spent 30 years building an empire, specifically to destroy people like Don T. Campbell, Jr. Chapter 3, The First Move. Dominic's approach was unhurried, almost leisurely, but something in his movement made conversations die at every table he passed. It wasn't aggression. Aggression was crude, readable, something security could respond to. This was something older and more refined. The measured stride of a predator that had already decided the outcome and was simply allowing its prey the dignity of not knowing yet. Campbell's friends felt it first. The 3 young men in their designer casual wear, one in a Brunello Cucinelli polo that cost more than most people's monthly rent, another sporting limited edition sneakers that required bot networks to purchase, had been laughing and filming just moments ago. Now they'd gone quiet, their phones lowering as some primal instinct overrode their inherited arrogance. The one closest to Dominic, a venture capitalist's son whose Instagram bio listed entrepreneur, despite never having worked, actually stood up before Dominic reached the table. "I just remembered I have a call," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Yeah, me too," said another, already moving. The third just left without bothering to excuse himself, walking quickly toward the exit as if the building were on fire and only he could smell the smoke. Campbell watched them go with irritation flickering across his face, but he was still smiling when Dominic stopped at his table. Still confident, still untouchable in the armor of his last name and his father's money. "Can I help you?" Campbell asked, his tone making it clear he had no intention of helping anyone. Dominic pulled out the chair across from Campbell and sat without asking permission. The gesture was smooth, practiced, the movement of a man accustomed to taking seats at tables where he wasn't invited and staying until he was finished. "My name is Dominic Cross," he said simply, his voice carrying that faint accent he'd never bothered to eliminate. "And I believe you owe Miss Washington an apology and restitution for your assault." The name landed like a physical blow. Dominic watched the recognition flicker across Campbell's face, not immediate understanding, but the nagging sense that he'd heard that name somewhere, in some context that made his father's lawyers nervous. Campbell's smile faltered for just a moment before his arrogance reconstructed it. "I don't know who you think you are," Campbell said, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. "But you need to mind your own business, old man. This is between me and the help." "The help," Dominic repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "Is that what Miss Washington is to you? Not a person with a name, a family, a life that matters as much as yours. Just the help that you can burn and humiliate for your amusement." Campbell's jaw tightened. "Listen, I don't know what your problem is, but I suggest you get up and walk away before this becomes an issue. My father is Donald Campbell. Campbell Holdings. We own half the commercial real estate in this city. One phone call and I can make your life very, very difficult." Around them, the restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had ceased. Everyone was watching now, not with the performative ignorance from before, but with genuine attention. Because Dominic Cross sitting at someone's table wasn't a social call. It was a declaration. "I'm aware of your father's holdings," Dominic said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. "The office tower on Madison that's currently under investigation for construction code violations. The residential complex in Queens where 3 rent-controlled tenants mysteriously accepted buyouts after their apartments experienced recurring gas leaks. The development in Brooklyn where environmental reports were filed after approval rather than before. Quite an empire built on interesting methods." Campbell's face had gone pale. "You can't, those are sealed investigations. How do you?" "I make it my business to know things, Mr. Campbell. For instance, I know that you're not actually authorized to negotiate acquisitions for your father's company despite your title. I know about the harassment settlements. There are 5 now, not 3, though I suppose the recent ones haven't reached your father's desk yet. I know about the DUI last March that cost your family $250,000 in donations to make disappear. I even know about the Lamborghini you drive. It's leased, not owned, a detail you've carefully omitted from your social media presence." Dominic leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even more weight. "So when you tell me you can make my life difficult with one phone call, I want you to understand something very clearly. I've forgotten more about your family's vulnerabilities than you ever knew existed. Your father built his empire in shadows. I live in those shadows. The question isn't whether I can destroy you. The question is how much of your family I'll need to dismantle before you understand that you've made a mistake." Campbell's hands were gripping the edge of the table now, knuckles white. His breathing had gone shallow, but the arrogance was still there, that final refuge of men who'd never truly been challenged. "You're threatening me. Do you have any idea what my father will do when I tell him some immigrant thug tried to shake me down in a public restaurant?" The slur hung in the air between them. Dominic smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a chess master watching his opponent make the exact move he'd anticipated, the move that would lead to inevitable checkmate in exactly 7 moves. "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Campbell. I'm educating you. There's a difference." Dominic stood, buttoning his jacket with that same practiced motion. "You're going to apologize to Miss Washington. You're going to pay her medical expenses and compensate her for emotional distress. I'm thinking $50,000 is appropriate for assault and public humiliation. And you're going to do this within the next 5 minutes, or I'm going to make a phone call of my own." "Go ahead," Campbell sneered, some of his confidence returning now that Dominic was leaving. "Call whoever you want. My father has the best lawyers in New York. You can't touch me." Dominic paused, looking back at Campbell with something almost like pity. "Mr. Campbell, I'm not going to call lawyers. I'm going to call the journalists who have been sitting on stories about your family for years, waiting for someone powerful enough to protect them from retaliation. I'm going to call the prosecutors who need political cover to go after your father. I'm going to call your family's business partners and explain why their association with Campbell Holdings has become a liability." Dominic's voice went very quiet. "And then I'm going to sit back and watch what happens when your father realizes his son just started a war we're going to win." Chapter 4. The Files. Campbell's face had gone from pale to flushed, a red creeping up his neck that spoke of rage warring with the first whispers of genuine fear. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving with the frantic energy of someone calling in reinforcements. "Don't bother," Dominic said, still standing. "Your father is currently in a meeting with the Zoning Commission, 3rd floor of City Hall, Conference Room B. He's trying to push through permits for the Hudson Yards development, the one where you're planning to displace 200 rent-stabilized tenants." He won't answer. Campbell's thumb froze over the screen. "How could you possibly?" "Because I know everything, Mr. Campbell. That's what I've been trying to explain." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim leather portfolio. He opened it carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper that he placed on the table between them. "For instance, I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. 4 of them, established between 2019 and 2023, holding approximately $18 million that's never appeared on any tax return filed by you or your father." Campbell's eyes went wide. He stared at the paper, a bank statement with the Campbell Holdings logo watermarked faintly in the background, account numbers partially redacted, but still clearly identifiable. That's confidential. That's attorney-client privilege. You can't." "Attorney-client privilege protects communications with your lawyer, Mr. Campbell, not financial records held by Cayman banks with notoriously porous security." Dominic placed another sheet on the table. "This is an email from your father to his CFO, dated March 15th of last year. The subject line is Wung Deal, insider information. In it, your father discusses purchasing stock in a pharmaceutical company 3 days before the FDA approval that tripled its value. He knew about the approval because he played golf with the commissioner. That's textbook insider trading." Campbell's hand trembled as he reached for the paper, then thought better of touching it, as if the evidence might burn him the way his coffee had burned Emily. "Then there are the NDAs," Dominic continued, his voice maintaining that same conversational tone, as if discussing the weather rather than systematically destroying a man's life. He placed 3 more documents on the table, arranged in a neat row. "Ashley Rodriguez, 2021. She was a junior analyst at your firm. Settlement of $250,000 after you cornered her in the supply room." The complaint detailed sexual assault, but your father's lawyers negotiated it down to inappropriate workplace conduct. Another document joined the collection. "Jennifer Park, 2022. Paralegal at the law firm handling your real estate acquisitions. 300,000, similar circumstances. You told her that sleeping with you was networking and that refusing would be career limiting." A 5th document. "Maria Gonzalez, 2023. She was a waitress, Mr. Campbell, just like Miss Washington. You assaulted her at a private event your family hosted. $400,000 settlement, signed just 8 months ago. Your father's lawyers made her sign an NDA so restrictive she can't even mention she worked the event." Campbell was no longer looking at the papers. He was staring at Dominic with something approaching horror, the reality finally penetrating through layers of entitlement and arrogance. "You've been investigating us." "For 6 months," Dominic confirmed. Your family came to my attention when you tried to acquire a building in Queens that houses a community center I've supported for years. Your father's initial offer was generous, but when the board refused to sell, suddenly the building failed inspections it had passed for decades. Suddenly there were structural concerns that required expensive remediation. Suddenly the property taxes were reassessed at triple their previous value. Dominic's expression hardened. That's when I became interested in the Campbell family business practices, and what I found was fascinating. A multi-generational study in how wealth enables cruelty, how privilege becomes sociopathy when left unchecked. He placed one more document on the table. This one was thicker, bound with a black clip. The Campbell Family Foundation. On paper, it's a charitable organization that donated $4 million last year to various causes. Very admirable. Except that 90% of those donations went to organizations that your father controls or that directly benefit Campbell Holdings. The art museum where your mother sits on the board and where you store paintings that appreciate in value while you claim charitable deductions. The business school where you buy influence with endowed chairs. The homeless shelter that's actually a real estate holding company that allows you to purchase and demolish properties under the guise of philanthropy. Dominic leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It's not charity, Mr. Campbell. It's tax evasion with good publicity, and the IRS would be very interested in these discrepancies if someone were to bring them to the right person's attention. Campbell's face had gone through pale to flushed and arrived at a sickly gray. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The arrogance had finally cracked, revealing the frightened man-child underneath who'd never actually faced consequences because his father's money had always provided immunity. What do you want? His voice came out hoarse. I told you what I want. An apology to Miss Washington. $50,000 for her pain and suffering. And a promise that you'll never set foot in this restaurant or any establishment where she works ever again. That's it. Campbell's laugh was desperate, slightly manic. You have all this, you could destroy us, and you just want $50,000 and an apology. Dominic straightened, gathering his documents and returning them to the leather portfolio with meticulous care. I don't want your family's empire, Mr. Campbell. I want you to understand that having money doesn't make you untouchable. It just means you have further to fall. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Campbell, these documents I've shown you, copies. I have the originals stored somewhere very safe, along with about 400 pages of additional material. Insurance, you might call it, to ensure you keep your promises. Campbell sat frozen, staring at the empty table where the evidence had been moments before, understanding finally settling over him like a burial shroud. He wasn't untouchable after all. He just never met someone with the power and patience to prove it. Chapter 5. The cage closes. Campbell's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, the sound cutting through the restaurant's tense silence. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his phone, jabbing at the screen with the frantic energy of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. I'm leaving, he announced, his voice pitched higher than before. And you're going to regret this. My father has an army of lawyers. We'll bury you in litigation. We'll. His phone made a soft, declining sound. Campbell stared at the screen, confusion flickering across his face. He tried again. Same result. The call wouldn't connect. Problem? Dominic asked mildly. He'd moved to stand near the entrance, positioned between Campbell and the door with the casual posture of someone merely observing rather than blocking an exit. Network's acting up, Campbell muttered, trying a third time. Nothing. He switched to his father's cell phone. The call started connecting. Campbell's face flooded with relief, then dropped after a single ring. He tried again. Same result. Across the restaurant, a man in a navy suit at table 12 glanced at his own phone and smiled slightly. Roger Smith, Dominic's primary strategist, had been sitting there since before Campbell arrived, looking for all the world like a businessman enjoying a leisurely lunch. His fingers moved across his phone screen in a quick pattern, then went still. Campbell tried calling his father's office line. This time the call connected, but he got the receptionist. Campbell Holdings, how may I direct your call? It's Don Jr. I need to speak to my father immediately. It's an emergency. I'm sorry, Mr. Campbell, but your father left specific instructions not to be disturbed during the zoning meeting. Can I take a message? No, you can't take a fucking message. Get him on the phone now. Sir, I can't interrupt a meeting with the zoning commission. Is there someone else who can help you? Campbell ended the call with a vicious jab. His next call was to the family's head lawyer, Richard Morrison, a man whose entire career was built on making Campbell family problems disappear. The call connected. Campbell nearly sobbed with relief. Richard, thank God, I need you to. I'm sorry, who is this? Campbell's face went blank with confusion. It's Don Campbell, Don Jr. What do you mean, who is this? There was a pause. Mr. Campbell, I'm afraid I can no longer represent you or your family. I've sent termination letters to your father's office as of this morning. My firm has decided to pursue other clients. What? You can't. We pay you $500,000 a year in retainer fees alone. Which is precisely why this decision was so difficult. But my partners and I have decided this relationship is no longer tenable. I'm sure you'll find excellent representation elsewhere. Now, if you'll excuse me. The line went dead. Campbell stared at his phone as if it had transformed into something alien. His breathing had gone rapid, shallow. He tried another lawyer from his contacts. That firm's receptionist informed him politely that they had a conflict of interest and couldn't take his case. A third firm claimed they were at capacity. A fourth suddenly had no record of ever working with the Campbell family despite handling 3 acquisitions for them in the past 2 years. What did you do? Campbell's voice cracked on the last word. Me? Nothing, Dominic said. But hypothetically, if someone had spent 6 months documenting a family's criminal activities, they might share that information with law firms who value their reputations. Lawyers tend to develop sudden ethical concerns when association with a client might lead to their own disbarment. Campbell's next move was predictable. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a black American Express card, the Centurion card that marked him as someone with essentially unlimited credit. I'm calling a car service, and then I'm getting the best security money can buy, and we'll see how tough you are when. His phone chimed. A text message from American Express. Your account has been temporarily frozen pending verification of suspicious activity. Please call our fraud department. Campbell's hands were trembling violently now. He tried his Visa, same message. His MasterCard, frozen. Even his Chase Sapphire Reserve declined. At a table near the kitchen, a woman with silver-streaked hair that she wore in an elegant bun glanced up from her tablet. Baca, another of Dominic's key strategists, had connections throughout the banking industry that made frozen accounts a matter of a few phone calls to the right compliance officers. She nodded almost imperceptibly to Dominic before returning her attention to her screen. Campbell physically stumbled, catching himself against a chair. This is impossible. You can't just, there are laws, regulations. You can't freeze someone's accounts without cause. Of course not, Dominic agreed. That would be highly illegal, but banks do have fraud detection algorithms, and those algorithms do get triggered when someone flags unusual transaction patterns. The cash withdrawals, the overseas transfers, the payments to individuals who then make political donations on your family's behalf, all perfectly legitimate, I'm sure. But the algorithms don't know that. They just see patterns that look suspicious and automatically freeze accounts pending investigation. Usually takes 3 to 5 business days to sort out. Campbell pulled out his phone again, this time opening an app. Fine, I'll call an Uber. I'll go to my father's office and we'll. His phone chimed again. This time it was a notification from his Uber account. Your account has been temporarily suspended due to a violation of our community guidelines. The same notification appeared for Lyft, then for the car service app he used. One by one, every transportation option on his phone became unavailable. Campbell's breath was coming in gasps now. You can't, you're trapping me here. I'm not trapping you anywhere, Mr. Campbell. You're free to leave any time you want. You could walk. The subway station is 3 blocks that way. Dominic gestured. Of course, you could also call a security company. There are several in the city that provide executive protection. Campbell was already scrolling through his contacts. He found the number for Sentinel Security, the firm his family used for high-profile events. The call connected. Sentinel Security, how can we help you? This is Don Campbell, Jr. I need immediate protective services. I'm at Bellissimo Restaurant and I need. I'm sorry, Mr. Campbell, but we're unable to accommodate your request at this time. What do you mean unable? We've used your services for years. Our specialists are all currently assigned to other clients. We have no available personnel. Campbell tried 2 more firms, then a third. Each gave some variation of the same response: no availability, scheduling conflicts, personnel shortages. One was remarkably honest. Mr. Campbell, we've been advised that providing services to your family at this time might expose our company to liabilities we're not prepared to assume. Across the restaurant, near the wine cellar entrance, a young man who looked barely 30 was typing rapidly on his phone. Danny, the youngest of Dominic's strategists, but perhaps the most connected, had relationships throughout the city's private security industry. A few well-placed calls suggesting that Campbell protection details might find themselves named in forthcoming lawsuits had been remarkably effective. Campbell slowly lowered his phone. His face had gone slack, the arrogance finally completely stripped away. He looked around the restaurant, at the patrons still frozen in their seats, at Marcus hovering uselessly near the kitchen, at Dominic watching him with that same calm expression. What do you want from me? The question came out as almost a whisper. I already told you what I want, Mr. Campbell. An apology, restitution, basic human decency. The question is whether you're ready to provide it. Chapter 6, The Billionaire's Reckoning. The restaurant's front door burst open with enough force to rattle the wine glasses. Donald Campbell, SR, entered like a storm system, 3 lawyers in his wake, and an expression that had probably made senators reconsider their positions. He was 63, silver-haired like Dominic, but with the kind of tan that came from vacations in the Maldives rather than dock work under Brooklyn's sun. His suit was Brioni, his watch a Patek Philippe Grand Complications, his presence the cultivated authority of a man who'd spent 4 decades bending the city to his will. Where is he, Campbell, SR? S voice carried across the restaurant, and several diners actually flinched. Where's the son of a bitch threatening my son? Marcus materialized from nowhere, his face pale. Mr. Campbell, sir, if I could just... Not you, Campbell, SR, dismissed him with a glance and found his target. His son, still standing near his table, looking smaller and younger than he had an hour ago. And across from him, the man in the charcoal suit who hadn't moved, hadn't shown any reaction to the dramatic entrance. Campbell, SR, strode across the restaurant, his lawyers scrambling to keep pace. He stopped at his son's table, took in the scene, his son's trembling hands, the fear in his eyes, the defeated slouch of his shoulders. Then he turned his full attention to Dominic. I don't know who the hell you think you are, Campbell, SR, began, his voice dropping to the dangerous register that had reportedly made a city councilman resign after a 5-minute phone call. But you've made the worst mistake of your life. Threatening my son, interfering with his accounts, harassing him in a public place. I'll have you arrested for extortion, for harassment, for every crime my lawyers can think of. And when we're done destroying you in criminal court, we'll take everything you have in civil proceedings. One of the lawyers, a sharp-faced woman in a gray suit, stepped forward with a tablet. We've already contacted the NYPD. Detectives are on their way, and we've prepared preliminary filings for restraining orders and... Catherine, Dominic said quietly, and the lawyer stopped mid-sentence. Her face went pale. Catherine Morrison, Harvard Law, class of 2008. You made partner at Morrison and Associates last year, which was quite impressive considering your father-in-law is the managing partner. Tell me, does the New York Bar Association know that you've been filing briefs in cases where your husband's construction company has financial interests? That seems like a conflict of interest that might warrant investigation. Catherine's mouth opened and closed without sound. Campbell S.R.'s eyes narrowed. How do you know? I know everything, Mr. Campbell, just as I know everything about you. Dominic finally stood, and somehow the movement made him seem larger, more present. Your son seems to think this is about him. It's not. It never was. He's just the symptom. You're the disease. How dare you? Donald Trevor Campbell, Dominic continued, his voice never rising but somehow cutting through Campbell S.R.'s bluster like a scalpel. Born 1962 in White Plains to a middle-class family. Your father was a building inspector, which was convenient when you started your first development project in 1989. That project should never have passed inspection. The foundation work was substandard. The electrical was below code. But your father signed off anyway. The building is still standing in Queens, still housing families who don't know they're living in a structure that should have been condemned before it was finished. Campbell S.R.'s face had gone rigid. Ancient history, and you can't prove. I can prove everything. Dominic gestured to Roger Smith, who approached with a leather briefcase. Roger opened it on the table, revealing stacks of documents organized with meticulous precision. 23 buildings constructed between 1989 and 2003 with falsified inspection reports. 14 instances of bribery, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger as your empire grew. The offshore accounts your son mentioned. Those started with you in 1995, when you realized that paying taxes was cutting into your profit margins. Dominic pulled out a document and held it up. This is a signed affidavit from Marcus Delgado, a former city inspector who took payments from you for 18 years. He's dying of lung cancer now, Mr. Campbell. Stage 4. He decided he wanted to make peace with God before the end, which meant making peace with his conscience. He's provided dates, amounts, specific violations he overlooked. He's willing to testify. Campbell S.R.'s lawyers exchanged glances. One of them, an older man who'd probably been handling Campbell business for decades, reached for his phone. I wouldn't, Dominic said mildly. Your phones work, unlike your client's sons, but the people you'd call have already been contacted. The police commissioner who usually handles your problems. He's currently meeting with the FBI about corruption charges, unrelated to you, but he's unavailable. The judge who's been favorable to Campbell interests. She recused herself from all Campbell-related cases this morning after receiving information about some concerning financial entanglements. Dominic returned the affidavit to the briefcase and extracted another document. Then there's the fraud. The Hudson Yards development that you're trying to push through right now. The one where you're displacing 200 rent-stabilized tenants. You've told the zoning commission that you're planning affordable housing units, 30% of the development, you claimed. But I have the real plans, the ones you showed to your investors. Luxury condos starting at $3 million. Not a single affordable unit in the actual design. That's not fraud, that's just preliminary planning. It's fraud when you make material misrepresentations to a government body to obtain permits and tax incentives worth $40 million. Dominic's voice remained conversational, but every word landed with precision. It's fraud when you've already presold units to foreign investors based on luxury specifications while telling the city you're building affordable housing. It's fraud when the tax abatements you're receiving are specifically designated for affordable housing developments. Campbell S.R. had gone very still. The bluster had evaporated, replaced by the calculating look of a man reassessing his opponent. What do you want? I want you to understand something that your money has let you forget, Dominic said. You're not above consequences. You've simply been very good at avoiding them. Your money bought silence from inspectors, from politicians, from victims. It bought you time and space to build an empire on a foundation of corruption. Dominic leaned forward slightly. But here's what you failed to understand, Mr. Campbell. My money bought the people you paid, the inspectors you bribed. I've been more generous. The politicians in your pocket, I've provided more compelling incentives. The victims you silenced with NDAs, I've offered them protection you can't touch and compensation that makes your settlements look like insults. He straightened. Your empire was built in shadows, Mr. Campbell, but you made the mistake of thinking those shadows belong to you. They don't. They never did. Chapter 7. Emily's Voice. Emily Washington stood in the hallway of the 14th precinct, her hands still shaking, but no longer from fear alone. The burn on her chest had been treated at Mount Sinai, courtesy of an ambulance that had arrived at Bellissimo within minutes of Dominic's quiet phone call, and a hospital bill that had somehow been marked paid in full before she'd even left the emergency room. Now she was flanked by two lawyers she'd never met before yesterday. Sarah Chen, a former federal prosecutor who'd left the U.S. Attorney's Office to start her own practice, sat to her right reviewing notes with the intensity of someone preparing for trial. On her left was Marcus Williams, a civil rights attorney whose name Emily recognized from news coverage of high-profile police brutality cases. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said for the third time, her voice gentle but professional. "Mr. Cross has already secured compensation for you. You have enough money to cover your mother's treatment and your expenses for the next 2 years. You could walk away right now." Emily looked at the closed door of the interview room where Detective Lisa Morrison was waiting. "Will he face charges if I don't testify?" Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. "Probably not," Marcus admitted. "Assault cases without victim cooperation rarely proceed. The restaurant won't cooperate. They're afraid of Campbell retaliation. The other patrons have suddenly developed selective amnesia. Without your testimony, this becomes he said, she said. And the Campbells have historically been very good at making those cases disappear." "Then I have to do this." Emily's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "Because if I don't, he'll do it again, to someone else, someone who might not have." She gestured vaguely at the lawyers, at the protection she still didn't fully understand. "All of this." Sarah nodded slowly, something like respect crossing her face. "Then let's make sure your testimony counts." The interview took 3 hours. Detective Morrison was thorough, professional, and Emily noticed, surprisingly deferential. The detective who'd initially responded to the restaurant had tried to dismiss the incident as a civil matter, not criminal. Morrison had shown up an hour later, reassigned to the case by someone higher up the chain, someone who'd suddenly decided that assaults in upscale restaurants required senior detective attention. Emily didn't know that Morrison had received a phone call from the deputy commissioner, who'd received a call from someone unnamed, who'd provided information about several unsolved cases involving the Campbell family. She didn't know that Morrison's captain had been handed a file 3 inches thick, documenting a pattern of violence that made Emily's assault part of something much larger. She just knew that Morrison listened to every word, took detailed notes, and treated her like someone whose story mattered. "The photos from the emergency room show second-degree burns consistent with hot liquid contact," Morrison said, reviewing her tablet. "We have the incident report from the responding officers, though it's," she paused delicately, "notably incomplete. But your testimony provides what we need to establish assault. Combined with the other evidence we've received, this case is prosecutable." "Other evidence?" Emily asked. Morrison glanced at Sarah, who nodded permission. "You're not the first person Don T. Campbell, Jr., has assaulted. You're just the first one willing to testify about it in a criminal proceeding." By the time Emily left the precinct, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple that seemed almost peaceful despite the chaos of the day. Marcus walked her to a black SUV where a driver was waiting, security that Dominic had insisted on, protection that Emily was starting to understand she needed. "There will be more attention now," Marcus warned as they approached the vehicle. "The Campbells will try to discredit you, to make this about something other than what it was. You need to be prepared for that." Emily nodded, but her attention was caught by her phone buzzing with a text from an unknown number. "I saw what happened at Bellissimo. Campbell did the same thing to me 2 years ago. They paid me to stay quiet, but I'm tired of being quiet. Can you help?" Another message appeared from a different number. "Is it true someone is finally standing up to the Campbells? They threatened my family when we tried to fight an eviction. I have documentation." Then another. "Campbell Holdings destroyed my father's business when he wouldn't sell. I have emails." Sarah's phone was buzzing too. So was Marcus's. They looked at each other with the expression of lawyers who just realized their case had transformed from difficult to devastating. "How many?" Emily asked quietly. Sarah scrolled through her messages, her eyes widening. 12 so far. No, 15. They're still coming in." Marcus was already on his phone, calling his office to arrange intake appointments. "This is exactly what we hoped for. Once one person speaks, others find the courage. It's a dam breaking." Emily understood then what Dominic had meant when he'd told her, through Sarah, that her testimony wasn't charity. It was strategy. He'd needed someone to go first, to show that the Campbells could be challenged. She'd become the proof of concept, the demonstration that standing up to them didn't mean destruction. But strategy or not, these were real people. Real victims who'd been waiting for someone to tell them it was safe to speak. Over the next 48 hours, the number grew to 23. Former employees who'd been harassed or assaulted, tenants who'd been illegally evicted, small business owners who'd been threatened, people who'd been paid to be silent or intimidated into silence, all suddenly finding their voices because one waitress had decided that money wasn't enough, that there had to be accountability. Dominic provided lawyers for all of them. Sarah Chen's practice suddenly had the resources to hire 4 additional attorneys. Marcus Williams received funding for a dedicated Campbell family litigation team. Every victim who came forward was offered legal representation at no cost, along with security services to protect against retaliation. "It must be costing him millions," Emily said to Sarah during a late-night strategy session in the lawyer's office. Sarah looked up from the deposition schedule she was reviewing. "It is, but Mr. Cross doesn't think in terms of expense. He thinks in terms of investment. Every person who testifies, every piece of evidence that surfaces, every news story that runs, it all adds up to something the Campbells can't buy their way out of. Public accountability." She leaned back in her chair, looking tired but energized. "The civil suits alone will take years and cost the Campbells tens of millions in settlements. The criminal cases will tie up their time and attention. The media coverage will destroy their reputation. Their business partners will start distancing themselves. Their political allies will find reasons to be busy when they call." Sarah smiled slightly. "Mr. Cross isn't trying to destroy them in one dramatic moment. He's building a cage around them, piece by piece, victim by victim, until they have nowhere left to run. And you," she gestured at Emily, "you're the first bar in that cage, the one that proved it could be built." Emily looked at the stack of files on Sarah's desk, each one representing a person who'd been hurt by the Campbell family. "I just wanted him to apologize." "I know," Sarah said gently, "but sometimes demanding an apology starts a revolution." Chapter 8, The Empire Burns. The collapse began quietly, the way most institutional failures do. Not with explosions, but with spreadsheets and conference calls, and carefully worded statements that tried to contain damage already spreading like fire through dry timber. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the incident at Bellissimo, the New York Times ran a front-page story. "Campbell Holdings, a legacy of intimidation and fraud." The article was devastating in its specificity, citing 23 victims by name, supported by documentation that must have taken months to compile. Offshore accounts, falsified inspection reports, a pattern of assault and intimidation spanning 3 decades. By Thursday afternoon, Campbell Holdings stock had dropped 18%. Investors were calling emergency meetings. The board was demanding explanations. And Donald Campbell, SR, was discovering that the relationships he'd cultivated for 40 years had suddenly become unavailable. The mayor, who'd attended Campbell family fundraisers for 12 years, released a statement expressing deep concern about the allegations and announcing a comprehensive review of all city contracts with Campbell Holdings. The governor, who'd benefited from Campbell campaign contributions, ordered the state attorney general to investigate potential fraud in multiple development projects. By Friday morning, 3 major banks had frozen credit lines to Campbell Holdings pending review of risk exposure. 2 international investment firms that had partnered on the Hudson Yards development announced they were withdrawing from the project. a pension fund that held significant Campbell Holdings bonds, released a statement questioning the company's financial transparency. The business media treated it like a feeding frenzy. Bloomberg ran an analysis of Campbell Holdings' debt structure, noting that the company had been leveraged far more aggressively than previously disclosed. The Wall Street Journal published an investigation into the offshore accounts, tracing money flows that suggested systematic tax evasion. Forbes deleted Donald Campbell Sr. from its billionaires list, noting that actual net worth appeared to be significantly overstated. But the social destruction was perhaps even more complete. Don T. Campbell Jr.'s Instagram account, once a shrine to conspicuous consumption with 200,000 followers, had been deleted, not by him, but by Instagram itself after the platform determined that some of his posts constituted documentation of criminal activity. His Twitter account was permanently suspended. His memberships at 3 exclusive clubs were quietly terminated with polite letters citing conduct incompatible with club values. The Lamborghini was repossessed on Friday afternoon, towed from in front of his apartment building while photographers captured every moment. The apartment itself, a $3 million penthouse in Tribeca that he'd claimed to own, turned out to be a rental, and the landlord's attorney delivered an eviction notice citing both non-payment and criminal activity on the premises. Campbell Jr.'s friends, those who'd laughed and filmed at the restaurant, had evaporated completely. His calls went to voicemail. His texts remained unanswered. When he showed up at his usual bar on Friday night, the owner personally asked him to leave, explaining that his presence was bad for business. The criminal charges came Monday morning. The district attorney, who'd spent the weekend reviewing evidence that had materialized from sources unknown, announced a grand jury indictment on multiple counts: assault, harassment, and, thanks to the video Campbell himself had filmed, evidence tampering and witness intimidation for threatening Emily Washington not to report the incident. But the final blow came from his own father. Tuesday afternoon, Donald Campbell Sr. called a press conference at the Campbell Holdings headquarters. He stood before a room packed with reporters, his face carefully composed into an expression of disappointed authority, and read from a prepared statement. "I built Campbell Holdings on principles of integrity and accountability. Recent revelations about my son's behavior have shown that he does not share those principles. Effective immediately, Donald Trevor Campbell Jr. is terminated from all positions within Campbell Holdings and removed from the board of directors. He will have no further involvement in any Campbell family business interests." A reporter shouted a question. "Are you disowning your son?" Campbell Sr.'s jaw tightened. "I'm holding him accountable for his actions, something I should have done years ago. My failure as a father doesn't excuse his behavior as a man. The company will not be brought down by one individual's criminal conduct." The statement was calculated, crafted by crisis management consultants who understood that the only way to save the Campbell empire was to sacrifice its heir. Cut off the infected limb to save the body. It didn't work. Wednesday brought news that the state attorney general was expanding her investigation to include Donald Campbell Sr. Personally, the evidence that had surfaced about his son's crimes had led investigators to patterns in the company's practices that predated Junior's involvement. The offshore accounts, the falsified inspections, the systematic fraud, all of it traced back to decisions made at the senior level. By Thursday, 2 more board members had resigned. A major development project in Boston was canceled when financing fell through. Campbell Holdings' credit rating was downgraded to junk status. The phone in Donald Campbell Sr.'s office rang constantly, but now it was lawyers calling with bad news, investors demanding explanations, partners dissolving agreements. The same phone that had once connected him to the city's power brokers now only brought disaster updates. Don T. Campbell Jr., meanwhile, had been arrested Tuesday evening. Bail was set at $500,000, an amount that would have been trivial a week ago, but his father's lawyers declined to post it. His father's accountant had frozen his access to family trusts. His mother's assistant returned his calls with the message that Mrs. Campbell was unavailable indefinitely. He spent 3 nights in Rikers Island before a bail bondsman agreed to take the case, charging triple the usual rate because of the media attention. When Campbell Jr. finally emerged, he found that the locks had been changed on his apartment, his belongings placed in storage he couldn't afford to retrieve. The man who'd poured coffee on a waitress because he was bored, because he could, because there had never been consequences, that man discovered what consequences actually looked like. No money, no friends, no family willing to claim him, no future that looked anything like the life he'd always assumed was his birthright. He'd become exactly what he'd always treated service workers as, disposable. And somewhere in the city, in a corner booth of a restaurant, Dominic Cross read the news coverage with the satisfaction of a chess player who'd predicted every move, who'd known exactly how this would end from the moment he'd set down his espresso cup and decided that enough was enough. The Campbells had learned what Dominic had always known. Empires built on cruelty don't fall in a day. They collapse slowly, inevitably, under the weight of every unpaid debt, every buried victim, every lie that seemed safe until someone finally decided to tell the truth. Chapter 9. The Return to Shadows. 6 weeks after the coffee incident, Emily Washington walked into her new office on the 23rd floor of a building in Midtown. The view stretched across Manhattan, glass and steel towers catching the morning light in ways that still made her pause. She'd never imagined working somewhere like this, somewhere with her name on the door and a title that didn't involve carrying trays or memorizing drink orders. Director of Community Outreach for the Meridian Foundation. The position had materialized through a phone call from Sarah Chen, who'd explained that a nonprofit needed someone with Emily's unique perspective on economic inequality and victim advocacy. The salary was triple what she'd made waitressing. The benefits included health insurance comprehensive enough to cover her mother's treatment without the constant panic about copays and deductibles. Emily understood that Dominic Cross had arranged this. Just as he'd arranged the settlement, $200,000 that had appeared in her account with a letter explaining it represented compensation for damages, medical expenses, and pain and suffering. Just as he'd arranged for security during the trial, for lawyers who treated her like a client rather than a case number, for every detail that had transformed her from victim to something more like victor. She'd tried to thank him once, through Sarah. The response had come back through the same channel. "Miss Washington owes me nothing. I simply restored a balance that should never have been disturbed." Now she stood in her new office, looking at framed photographs she'd brought from home, her mother at last month's chemotherapy appointment, smiling despite exhaustion, her younger sister at her college graduation, a degree Emily's income had helped fund. Evidence that sometimes the universe corrected itself, even if it needed help. Across the city, in a courtroom in Lower Manhattan, Don T. Campbell, Jr., stood before a judge for sentencing. The trial had been swift, almost anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming. The video he'd filmed himself, Emily's testimony, the testimonies of 3 other victims who'd found courage after she'd spoken first. The pattern of behavior so clear that even his own lawyer had advised pleading guilty to reduced charges rather than risking a jury trial. 18 months incarceration, followed by 3 years probation and mandatory completion of an anger management program, the judge announced. Additionally, the defendant is ordered to pay restitution to all victims in amounts to be determined by separate civil proceedings. Campbell Jr. stood motionless as the bailiff approached. No family members sat in the gallery behind him. His father was currently fighting his own legal battles. The state investigation had uncovered enough evidence to bring fraud charges that could result in a prison sentence far longer than his son's. His mother had relocated to their house in the Hamptons and changed her phone number. His friends had long since moved on to other social circles where his name was a punchline or a warning. He'd become invisible in the way Emily had once been invisible, a person society had decided didn't matter enough to notice. That same afternoon, Dominic Cross returned to Bellissimo for the first time since the incident. Marcus, the manager, nearly dropped the wine bottle he was holding when Dominic walked through the door. But Dominic simply nodded politely and made his way to his usual corner booth, the one with the view of the entire restaurant and the exit. Roger Smith was already waiting, an espresso and a folder of documents in front of him. He'd aged slightly in the past weeks. The Campbell operation had required resources and attention that even Dominic's sophisticated network had found taxing. The final accounting came through, Roger said as Dominic settled into his seat. Between the legal fees, the victim compensation, the security costs, and the let's call them influence expenses, you've spent approximately $8 million on this operation. Dominic accepted the espresso that a visibly nervous waiter brought over. He sipped it, considering. And the results. Campbell Holdings is facing bankruptcy. The father will likely serve time. The son is in prison. 23 victims received justice and compensation. The city has opened investigations into construction fraud that should prevent similar behavior going forward. Roger paused. But the cost, $8 million and significant exposure of your network. People know you were involved now. The FBI has opened a file. You're on their radar in ways you haven't been before. Was it worth it? Roger asked the question carefully, the way someone might ask if an expensive vase was worth the price. Dominic set down his cup with that same deliberate precision he'd used 6 weeks ago, the gesture that had started everything. He looked out across the restaurant where new waitstaff moved between tables, where patrons ate and laughed, where life continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everyone in this room had watched what happened when someone finally said no to the Campbells. They'd seen that wealth wasn't immunity, that cruelty had costs even for the powerful. People forget that monsters don't always snarl, Dominic said finally. Sometimes they smile and wear expensive watches and pour coffee on waitresses because they're bored. They hide behind respectability and wealth and the assumption that no one will stop them. He turned his attention back to Roger. Someone has to remind them that predators hunt predators too. That's worth any cost. Roger nodded slowly, gathering his documents. The FBI agent handling your file is named Richardson. She's smart, persistent. She'll be a problem eventually. Eventually, Dominic agreed, but not today. As Roger left, Dominic remained in his booth, watching the restaurant with the patient attention of someone who understood that his work was never finished. There would always be more Campbells, more men who believed their money made them untouchable, more victims who needed someone willing to remind the powerful that consequences existed. A new waitress approached his table, young and nervous, carrying a coffee pot. "Would you like a refill, sir?" Dominic recognized the expression on her face, the careful politeness, the invisible armor that service workers wore, the readiness to accept whatever treatment came because bills needed paying and jobs were precious. "Please," he said gently. As she poured, he added, "What's your name?" She looked surprised at the question. "Jessica, sir." "Thank you, Jessica, and if anyone ever treats you with disrespect here, I want you to know that you have options. You don't have to accept cruelty as part of the job." He placed a business card on the table, Roger Smith's contact information. "If you ever need help, call this number." Jessica looked at the card, then at Dominic, something like understanding crossing her face. She'd probably heard the stories about what happened to the Campbell family, about the man who'd intervened when no one else would. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, pocketing the card. As she walked away, Dominic returned his attention to his espresso and the view of the restaurant. To some people in this room, he was a guardian, the man who'd proven that the vulnerable could be protected, that justice could be served even against the powerful. To others, he was a threat, a reminder that their wealth and position weren't as secure as they'd believed, that someone was always watching. Both interpretations were correct. Dominic Cross had spent 32 years building his empire in shadows, learning that true power wasn't about who shouted loudest but who understood most. And what he understood, what he'd always understood, was simple. Systems that failed people needed to be supplemented. Consequences that wealthy people avoided needed to be enforced. Balance that the law couldn't restore needed someone willing to tip the scales. He was that someone, and he'd remain in his corner booth, watching, waiting, ready for the next Don Campbell who forgot that cruelty always had costs. The monster who smiled had learned to smile back. And his smile was far more dangerous.